Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sue Lonnie Madsen, and let's jump right into this week's column and commentary, featuring a column headlined Chickens, Checks, and Conflicts of Interest, as published Thursday, January 4th, 2024 in the Spokesman Review. Did you get your chicken check from the Attorney General of Washington in December? If so, then you are the beneficiary of a consumer protection lawsuit filed by Bob Ferguson to protect you from corporate price fixing, fraud, and deception. You would know that because the Attorney General made sure his name was on the envelope, the check, and the letter announcing cheerfully, "Good news, you are receiving a refund." No purchase necessary to win, although according to Ferguson, he's sure, quote, "you paid more than you should have for chicken and canned tuna," end quote, and he is happy to return, quote, "this money to Washingtonians like you who were most harmed," end quote, by this illegal conduct. Even vegetarians are eligible. Ferguson announced the distribution in early December of approximately 402,200 checks to 1.2 million lucky low-income Washingtonians. The cutoff for low income is 175% of federal poverty level. Single-person households received $50, multi-person households were mailed $120 checks. The letters were immediately denounced for fraud and deception by a candidate for governor using his office to distribute a self-celebratory direct mail piece during a political campaign. An ethics complaint was filed on December 15th by former state legislator Toby Nixon, president of the Washington Coalition for Open Government from 2007 to 2021. Implementation has been disastrous. Santa Ferguson contracted with a company that managed to send checks addressed to people who've been dead for years, to people who don't exist, or mailed to addresses people have never lived at, based on experiences from a friend and current and former representatives on social media. The company also sent checks to people with household incomes exceeding the limit who are wondering if they should cash it anyway, or would that be committing fraud with a check from a fraud settlement? We can be sure the deceased don't exceed the income limit, but for everyone else, the question is, how would the Attorney General know who qualifies when we have no state income tax? And where did the database for the mismatched mailing come from? According to an email response from Brianna Aho, Communications Director for the Attorney General, the data comes from the private sector. This project is a public-private partnership. Experian put together the list of recipients, including names and addresses. Aho identified the claims administrator for the mailing as a company called Simpluris. The good news is Simpluris didn't use the state voter database, and the state didn't do the mailing. The bad news is Experian's database was flawed, troubling when many consumers rely on them for accurate credit scores. Experian did not reply to inquiries regarding the scope of its involvement in the public-private partnership. Experian was recently sued for causing financial harm to consumers by negligently reporting address information to lenders as high risk or identifying residential property as commercial. Experian did not admit to doing anything wrong, but agreed to pay $22.45 million to settle the lawsuit. Consumers who were on record as having requested a credit report were sent checks. Others who merely inquired had to file a claim form to receive a cash settlement in 2023. A class action lawsuit is supposed to pay out to those who were harmed, like the Experian suit. Tracking down everyone who bought overpriced chicken and canned tuna over the past 2 years would be unreasonable, so Ferguson negotiated a Cypres settlement. It's spelled C-Y-P-R-E-S. Pronounced Cypres, it means trying to get as close as possible to benefiting those who were harmed. It usually means making awards to charities related to the class of consumers in some way and praying it benefits them. Cypres awards are required to be reported to the legislature and published on the Attorney General's website. Such awards to charities have been commonly used by previous Attorneys General Rob McKenna and Christine Gregoire, as well as Ferguson. For example, in 2021, Ferguson negotiated a Cypres settlement with Healing Heroes Network for deceptive advertising by awarding $95,000 to another veteran services nonprofit instead of tracking down donors who were deceived. In a 2019 settlement with a nonprofit health system on the Kitsap Peninsula, funds were awarded to a selection of healthcare-related nonprofits instead of to patients who had been affected, although one would think it would be possible to find patients. In every case reported, Cypres awards were made to nonprofits instead of to individuals, until 2023, when the Attorney General also known as candidate for governor, had an opportunity to put his name in front of several 100,000 voters. Court cases are working their way to the U.S. Supreme Court by attorneys seeking to settle the question of attorney conflicts of interest in choosing how to distribute settlement funds. Cypre has the potential to be abused when the chosen charities are hand-picked favorites of the attorneys on either side of the negotiation, or of the judge approving the settlement. The Attorney General's team could have chosen a distribution to food banks hard-pressed to buy protein, clearly benefiting the class of people most affected by corporate chicken price fixing, and Bob Ferguson still could have crowed about it. Well, before this whole thing blew up, I had seen a bit of grumbling about this on social media. Oh, Bob Ferguson sending out checks. I hadn't paid it too much attention until a friend called me after picking up his mail to tell me that he'd just gotten a check, except it had his first name wrong, and he wasn't income eligible, and what the heck was going on? Now, in case you haven't seen one of these chicken checks, I've redacted his contact information, and it'll be posted as a photo on the Substack page. His reaction made me more curious, so I crowdsourced the question on Facebook, asking if any of my Washington friends had received a chicken check from the AG's office. And responses flooded in all day. There are over 3,000 people on my personal Facebook page, and I don't know all of them in real life. But almost immediately, I heard from a rancher I'd known since she was just a kid in high school who said her father-in-law got a check and he'd been dead for 13 years. And the stories kept coming in to various state representatives were putting pictures of these checks up on Twitter. Jim Walsh, who's the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, as well as serving as a state representative out of Aberdeen, was posting pictures on Twitter and collecting copies of Ferguson's letters. And then he received a check made out to his wife, Jamie, who was a friend of mine and an architectural colleague. Jamie was killed in a terrible accident 2 years ago, and seeing Jim holding that letter was hard. I can only imagine how hard it was on him. I followed up with Bob Ferguson's office on the Friday before the New Year's holiday and sent a gentle follow-up nudge by email on Tuesday morning to say I was hoping to hear back because I had a Wednesday deadline. I wasn't expecting her to be working over the weekend. And I'm sure Brianna Aho, the communications director, was having a very busy morning after New Year's Day. And her response email to me started off with this, quote, I see on social media that before you received our office's response, you have decided the chicken checks are a disaster, published your opinion, and are also alluding to an election conspiracy. It's hard to see these questions as asked in good faith when a conclusion has already been made and published. Nonetheless, I will provide answers. End of quote from Brianna. My reply to Brianna was, let me assure you that my questions were asked in good faith. The potential for disaster was impossible not to notice, and it became obvious as it spread over the weekend. As a columnist, I am accustomed to expressing my observations frankly and transparently. And I was glad to hear the responsibility for the mailing list and the database was outsourced, because I asked that last Friday before it became a trending topic, specifically because it will be essential to journalists, the AG, and the Secretary of State in addressing rumors of a corrupted state database. Although reporting on it now will be slamming the barn door after the horses roll down the road, the election integrity fallout was inevitable. From the first day, I had friends contacting me about concerns over receiving bad checks, payouts from a consumer fraud suit. Oh, the irony. And I really am. I want to emphasize. I'm really glad to find out that it was a separate database, nothing to do with the state voter database. There's nothing in this that has anything to do with election fraud. It does, however, emphasize the importance of having an accurate database before you start mailing things out. So here's the questions that I asked and Brianna's answers. First question: what entity is responsible for mailing the checks out? In-house at the Attorney General, another state agency, or outsourced to a contractor? And that was where she said the data came from a private sector, that it was a public-private partnership. That's going to be something that we'll be digging into, that Toby Nixon will be digging into in his public records request. A second question: how will income eligibility be verified, or will it be self-determined for those who apply for a check after this first round is mailed out? And her answer was, those filing a claim will be asked to attest to their information on penalty of perjury. The claims administrator will review the claims forms to ensure accuracy. In other words, nobody's checking. You just have to promise that you're not lying, or promise that you're not misrepresenting, or that you actually understand what the levels are and how you might or might not qualify. Third question: There are instructions on what to do if you are eligible and don't receive a check. What does someone do who isn't eligible yet received a check? And the answer was there's a claims process open for anyone who's eligible but did not receive a check. I looked into that. And then she said the claims administrator is instructing people who received a check in error to destroy it. But that assumes that they actually asked, because some people would just look at that and say, "Oh, I've got a refund," and go and cash it. And they don't mean any fraud. It's just kind of weird that this check showed up. So here's 2 questions I submitted that were not answered, and I'm still looking forward to seeing if we can dig into and find the answer. First question was, what database of names and addresses is being used to send these initial checks? I've already had one report from a personal friend of a man who's been dead for 13 years receiving a check, and that's one that I have not. We'll see if we can find out what kind of a database was Experian using. Is it one that they have from people who have a credit history? Because if they're using a database of people who have built a credit history, that would leave out some really poor households that could really use this kind of help, because they don't have a credit history. So they wouldn't even be in Experian's database, which makes Experian kind of an odd choice for the database. And the second question I don't really think I got an answer to is, given that Washington has no state income tax and no way of verifying income, how is household eligibility determined? And that I don't know how, again, if Experian is using its database of consumers who have built a credit history, that's really not going to tell them what their income is right now, because that information isn't updated on a regular basis, and apparently it's not updated on a very irregular basis if there's still people in there that are listed as having income who died 13 and more years ago. So finding both of those things out will be really interesting. Toby Nixon has filed several public records requests to dig into the decisions. How were decisions made to send checks out to be privately prepared and to such a messed up list? And when the information is available, I will cover it here as well. And so that's where I'm asking for you to subscribe for notification of new content. Meanwhile, the AG's office has been repeating the following mantra, both to me in an email, quoted in other media, so it's apparently a cut and paste response. It's not actually relevant to the checks, but it's meant to emphasize that they're still hard at work for you. And the quote is, "Our price-fixing lawsuit is not done. We still have a trial scheduled against multiple large companies that we allege were engaged in the conspiracy. We expect to prevail," end quote. So my next question would be, will the money be distributed in the same random manner? Not if Senator Mark Mullet and Senator Linda Wilson's bill to provide oversight on the mailing of checks to a list of random people who may or may not ever have been harmed by the actions that were under fire in a class action consumer protection suit like this one. And as Senator Mullet put it in an interview with Brandy Cruz on Undivided, imagine the uproar from the media and the Democratic Party if then Attorney General Rob McKenna had sent out 402,000 checks to random recipients the year he was running for governor. Mark Mullet, a Democrat, and Linda Wilson, a Republican, are co-sponsoring bipartisan Senate Bill 6078 to require legislative approval before the Attorney General starts sending out checks to random voters, whether or not there's an election coming up. It wouldn't interfere with distribution to individuals who were directly harmed, nor would it interfere with an Attorney General in the future negotiating a settlement that pays to relevant charities who serve the harmed class. That is, again, cypre hard to identify. Mark Mullet is also running for governor against Bob Ferguson, but he says he'd file the same bill even if he wasn't in the race. And I believe him. He has a track record of bucking his own party's line and working to hold his own colleagues accountable. A January 11th article in the Seattle Times gave space to the Attorney General's office to explain. And AG spokeswoman Brianna Aho is quoted as having provided to the Seattle Times a handwritten thank you letter from a Spokane woman who would use the check to pay her heating bill. So I'll see that anecdote and match it with this one. Following the publication of my column in the Spokesman Review, I received a thank you email from a Spokane woman named Shirley who had this to say. Shirley said, "I received a check addressed to my late husband Michael. I took it to my credit union for deposit only. I can't deposit it because he is no longer on my account. He passed away 7 years ago. In order for me to cash this, I have to send death certificate, proof I am a beneficiary, social security number, a letter. I am throwing the check away." I said I would return the check and they could make it out to Shirley. They said, send all this information. No way, I am too old and tired to mess around with all this nonsense. Now I can worry about identity theft. And she went on to explain her worry about identity theft is that she'd had a compromised account with another company. No need to mention them in this arena. A lot of spent hours trying to reach any of the 3 credit agencies to try to get her credit report checked. One of the credit agencies that she managed to reach wanted all of her info to be submitted over the internet, and since her account had been compromised over the internet, she said she wasn't going to send her information. And Shirley says, I don't know what to do. I just give up. I was not entitled to $120 anyway because I'm only one person. I did not know this until I read your column. Thank you for this interesting information. So there's my thank you note. I doubt the accuracy of assurances from the claims administrator via Ferguson's office that the error rate is less than 1% based on the people who have complained to the claims administrator, because that's not an easy thing to do. A better measurement would be to know how many checks are never even cashed, and that still won't tell us how many were cashed by people who didn't realize they weren't eligible. On the positive side, at least they apparently didn't send any checks to Nigeria like Governor Inslee's agency staff did with the unemployment during COVID. I mean, probably. Who knows? The Nigerian scammers aren't likely to complain either. Thanks for listening. Check out the links on the Substack page, including all the fascinating rabbit trails into the background and the pitfalls of Cypre Awards, including one where a judge decided to require a $1 million payment to his alma mater and then retired before he could be taken down on ethics charges. Subscribe to our Substack with or without a pledge for notifications of new content.